Nancy Ozims stood in the center of her dimly lit tailor shop in Queens, surrounded by racks of uncollected dry cleaning and bolts of cheap fabric that smelled of dust and desperation. Outside, the rain battered the glass window like it was trying to break in, but the real storm was already standing inside her fitting room. Min-Sik Park wasn't just a customer. He was the White Tiger of the underworld, a whispered legend in the streets, and right now, he was bleeding onto her linoleum floor. He stood perfectly still, wearing a bespoke Italian suit that cost more than her rent for 3 years, now ruined by a jagged tear and a blooming crimson stain on the shoulder. His eyes were cold, calculating, and darker than the alleyway shadows he'd emerged from. "Fix it," he had commanded, his voice low and jagged. "You have 5 minutes. I have a meeting." Nancy swallowed hard, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She knelt beside him to pin the cuff, trying to ignore the gun holstered beneath his jacket or the metallic scent of fresh violence clinging to his skin. Her hands, usually steady as a surgeon's, were shaking. She knew who he was. Everyone knew, and she knew that men like Min-Sik Park didn't tolerate mistakes. She worked fast, the needle flashing under the singular buzzing bulb. "Don't look up. Don't ask questions. Just stitch." But as the thunder cracked overhead, her hand trembled. Just once. But that was enough. Snap. Asterisk. The needle missed the silk and drove deep into the pad of her index finger. Nancy gasped, pulling back, but it was too late. A single, bright red drop of blood welled up and fell, landing perfectly on the pristine white cuff of his shirt. The air in the shop instantly froze. The silence was louder than the rain. Nancy stopped breathing. She had just stained the deadliest man in the city. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking, already imagining the bullet. "I'll get it out, I promise, please." But Min-Sik didn't pull a weapon. His hand shot out, gripping her wrist with a strength that bruised. He pulled her closer, invading her space until all she could see were those dark, unyielding eyes. He didn't look at the stain. He looked at her. Then, he did the unthinkable. He lifted her injured hand to his mouth. Nancy watched in paralyzed shock as his lips closed over her fingertip, tasting the copper and the fear. It wasn't an apology. It was a claim. He sucked the blood away, slow and deliberate, holding her gaze with an intensity that made her knees weak. What happens when a struggling seamstress accidentally binds herself to a mafia kingpin who decides she's his new favorite obsession? And what happens when the people who want him dead realize she's the only weakness he has? Buckle up. This wasn't just a repair job. It was the beginning of a war. The closed sign was already flipped, but the universe didn't seem to care about Nancy's store hours. Rain hammered against the glass of the Queen's storefront, drowning out the hum of the heater, until the bell above the door chimed, not a gentle tinkling, but a violent rattle as the door was shoved open. Nancy spun around, fabric shears in hand, her heart jumping into her throat. A man stood on the threshold, bringing the storm in with him. He was tall, drenched, and devastatingly handsome in a way that felt like a warning. Water dripped from his jet black hair onto the shoulders of a suit that cost more than her entire shop, but it was the dark stain spreading across his left side that froze her in place. "I'm closed," she stammered, gripping the shears tighter. Min-Sik Park didn't blink. He kicked the door shut behind him, silencing the wind. "Not tonight." His voice was low, a smooth baritone roughened by pain. He walked toward her, ignoring the puddle forming around his expensive leather shoes. "I need a repair. Now." He stopped right in front of her, the smell of rain, expensive cologne, and copper filling the small space. He pointed to a jagged tear on his cuff, seemingly ignoring the more serious injury at his side. "This. Fix it. I have a meeting in 20 minutes, and I cannot walk in looking like a brawler." Nancy should have called the police. She should have run, but the sheer gravitational pull of his presence pinned her feet to the floor. Without a word, she motioned him to the stool under the main light. He sat, extending his arm. Her hands shook as she threaded the needle. He watched her, his gaze heavy and unblinking, tracking every movement. The silence in the shop was suffocating, broken only by the sharp snick of the needle piercing the silk. She worked frantically, terrified of the man who breathed steadily despite his injuries. Then, the thunder cracked, shaking the floorboards. Nancy flinched. The needle slipped. She gasped as the steel point buried itself in her fingertip. A single, bright red drop of blood welled up, defying gravity before falling onto the pristine white cuff of his shirt. Nancy froze, horror washing over her. She had just ruined the suit of a man who looked like he killed people for sport. I'm so sorry, she breathed, reaching for a cloth. I can get it out. Min-Sik didn't let her reach. His hand shot out, clamping around her wrist with bruising strength. He didn't look at the stain. He looked dead at her. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled her hand toward his face. Nancy's breath hitched as his lips parted. He took her injured finger into his mouth, his tongue sweeping over the wound, tasting the copper. The sensation was electric, hot and wet against the cool air of the shop. He sucked the blood away, his eyes locking onto hers, darkening with something that wasn't anger. It was hunger. For 3 heartbeats, the world stopped. Then he released her hand, the contact breaking with a soft sound. He stood up abruptly, the tear in his suit forgotten. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick stack of $100 bills, dropping them onto her sewing table. Keep the change, he murmured, his voice rougher than before. Before Nancy could speak, he turned and vanished into the rainy night, leaving her alone in the sudden silence, staring at the blood-smeared money and her throbbing finger, which still felt branded by his touch. The morning sun did nothing to burn off the chill that had settled into Nancy's bones. She unlocked the shop door with a trembling hand, half expecting the police or a hitman to be waiting in the shadows. Instead, she found Mr. Henderson, her landlord, standing by the counter. He was a man who usually greeted her with a scowl and a demand for late fees, but today, he looked pale, clutching a clipboard to his chest like a shield. "It's taken care of," he mumbled, refusing to meet her eyes. He slid a receipt across the scratched glass of the counter. Nancy picked it up, her brows knitting together. "What is? I have the check for this month right here, I just need." "Not this month," Henderson interrupted, backing toward the door. "The whole year, paid in full, cash, and he said to fix the heater, or he'd be back to discuss the structural integrity of my kneecaps." The receipt fluttered from Nancy's fingers. A year of rent in Queens. It was more money than she made in 6 months. It wasn't a gift, it was a leash. Before she could ask who he was, though she already knew, Henderson was gone, practically running down the sidewalk. Nancy stared out the window, her stomach twisting into a knot. That's when she noticed the change. The street, usually bustling with morning commuters and delivery trucks, felt different around her shop. Directly across the street, a black sedan with tinted windows sat idling. It was sleek, predatory, and horribly out of place among the rusted Toyotas and delivery vans. By noon, the message was clear. Mrs. Higgins, a regular who came in every Tuesday to gossip and mend her church hats, walked toward the door, saw the black car, and immediately crossed the street, clutching her purse tight. The shop became a ghost town, an island of silence in the middle of the city. Then, the bell chimed. Nancy jumped, looking up from a dress she had been blindly staring at for an hour. 2 men walked in. They were built like vending machines, wearing suits that strained against thick necks and thicker arms. They didn't look like the type to care about hemlines. Boss sent us, the taller one grunted, dropping a garment bag onto the counter. He didn't smile. His eyes scanned the room, checking the exits, checking the windows, checking her. Nancy unzipped the bag. Inside was a pristine charcoal suit. There wasn't a thread out of place. What needs to be done to this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "It looks perfect. Alterations," the man said flatly. He leaned in, his shadow falling over her. "Take your time, Miss Nancy. We'll be right outside, making sure nobody disturbs you." He turned and walked out, taking up position next to the door like a gargoyle. Nancy watched him go, her hands gripping the cold fabric of the suit. They weren't customers. They were sentries. Min-Sik hadn't just paid her rent, he had drawn a perimeter. She was no longer just a seamstress in a struggling shop, she was territory. 3 nights later, the bell chimed again. This time, there was no rain, only the heavy, humid silence of a city waiting to exhale. Min-Sik Park walked in, and the air in the shop seemed to thin, sucked into the vacuum of his presence. He wasn't bleeding tonight. He moved with a lethal grace, the limp entirely gone, wearing a navy suit that fit him like a second skin. Nancy stood behind the counter, her knuckles white as she gripped a fabric swatch. "Your men have dropped off 5 suits," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "None of them needed fixing. "This one does," Min-Sik said, not stopping until he was on the other side of the counter, invading her sanctuary. He unbuttoned his jacket, revealing the gun holster against his crisp white shirt. "I need a new cut. Something bespoke. Measure me." It wasn't a request. Nancy swallowed hard and reached for her tape measure. She stepped around the counter, forcing herself into his orbit. Up close, he smelled of sandalwood and cold air. She raised her hands, wrapping the yellow tape around his chest. He was solid, unyielding muscle beneath the silk. As she pulled the tape tight, he expanded his chest, a subtle flex that brushed against her knuckles. "You paid my rent," she whispered, her eyes fixed on his tie knot. "You put guards outside. You're scaring my customers away." "I am filtering your customers," he corrected, his voice vibrating through her chest. "The rent is a detail. Do not bore me with details." Nancy pulled back, anger flaring through her fear. "I didn't ask for your charity. I don't want your money, and I don't want your protection. I want my life back." Min-Sik's hand shot out, capturing her wrist before she could retreat. He pulled her in, eliminating the space between them until her thighs bumped against his legs. The tape measure dangled from her free hand, a yellow line connecting them. "Your life," he scoffed, his dark eyes boring into hers. "You think that lock on your door protects you? The 7th Street Kings were planning to torch this block for insurance money next Tuesday. You, this shop, your father's legacy, ash." Within an hour, Nancy went cold. The 7th Street Kings were ruthless, they didn't leave survivors. "I had a conversation with their lieutenant," Min-Sik continued, his thumb tracing the pulse at her wrist, feeling it flutter. "They won't be coming back. No one touches this shop. No one touches you." "Why?" Nancy breathed, her defiance crumbling into confusion. "Why would you do that?" He leaned down, his lips brushing the shell of her ear, sending a shiver violently down her spine. "Because you bled for me," he murmured, the words heavy with a terrifying promise. "And now, you belong to me. Get used to it, Agassi." He released her wrist, leaving her breathless and burning, and turned to the mirror, adjusting his cuffs as if he hadn't just rewritten her entire world. The black sedan didn't take her home. Instead, the silent driver navigated the labyrinth of the meatpacking district, stopping behind an unmarked steel door that looked like the entrance to a slaughterhouse. But inside, the air shifted from rotting garbage to expensive cigars and conditioned leather. Nancy was escorted, her arm gripped firmly by a guard, down a spiral staircase into the belly of the city. The underground casino was an assault on the senses. Red velvet walls, the chaotic clatter of roulette wheels, and a thick haze of smoke that stung her eyes. She was marched past the main floor to a private VIP room at the back. Min-Sik sat at the head of a mahogany poker table, flanked by men who looked like they owned small countries. He held a glass of amber liquid, his face a mask of bored indifference. When Nancy entered, the room went quiet. "You're late," he said, not looking up from his cards. He extended his left arm. The silk lining of his jacket cuff was torn, hanging loose, a minor imperfection that a man like him clearly found intolerable. "Fix it. Here." Nancy hesitated, clutching her portable sewing kit. "Here. Now. Now." She had no choice. Nancy knelt beside his chair, feeling small and out of place in her jeans and oversized sweater. As she threaded her needle, the game resumed. The tension was palpable, a physical weight pressing down on the table. Chips clinked. Cards snapped. Nancy worked quickly, her breath hitching every time Min-Sik shifted. "Raise," Min-Sik said, his voice devoid of emotion. Across the table, a sweating man in a pinstripe suit laughed nervously. "You're bluffing, Park." Nancy felt Min-Sik's muscles tense beneath the fabric she was stitching. He didn't just sit, he coiled. She tied off the knot and bit the thread, scrambling back just as Min-Sik moved. It happened in a blur. Min-Sik didn't stand. He simply reached across the table, grabbed the pinstriped man by the hair, and slammed his face into the mahogany surface with a sickening crunch. Nancy screamed, covering her mouth. The room erupted. Guards drew weapons. Min-Sik stood slowly, pulling a card from the dazed man's sleeve, an ace of spades. He tossed it onto the blood-spattered chips. "Clean this up," Min-Sik ordered, wiping his hand on a napkin. He didn't yell. He didn't look angry. He looked exhausted. Two guards dragged the moaning cheater out. The other players sat frozen, terrified, staring at their drinks. Nancy looked up at Min-Sik from her spot on the floor. He stood alone in the center of the room, surrounded by wealth and fear, but untethered to anyone. For a split second, the mask slipped. His shoulders slumped, and a shadow of profound, crushing isolation passed over his face. He wasn't just a monster, he was a king on a throne of knives, waiting for the inevitable cut. He caught her staring, and the mask slammed back into place, but Nancy had already seen the man beneath the beast. The visits became a ritual, as predictable as the tides and just as unstoppable. Min-Sik stopped bringing torn suits. Instead, he simply brought himself, slipping into the shop just as Nancy turned the lock on the front door, seeking the silence of her workspace like a man starving for oxygen. It was a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the casino incident, when the dynamic shifted. The rain was falling again, a soft, rhythmic drumming against the glass. Nancy was in the back room, hovering over a hot plate, stirring a pot of goat meat pepper soup. The spicy, aromatic steam filled the small space, battling the smell of old wool and starch. When Min-Sik entered, he looked drained. The sharp lines of his face were drawn tight with exhaustion, and the darkness in his eyes seemed to have swallowed the light. He didn't bark orders. He just leaned against the cutting table, watching her. "You look hungry," Nancy said, surprising herself. She didn't sound afraid anymore. She sounded concerned. Min-Sik blinked, pulled from whatever violent memory he was replaying. "I do not eat while I work." "You're not working right now," Nancy countered. She ladled the rich, red broth into a chipped ceramic bowl and held it out. "And my father used to say a man who doesn't eat eventually starts consuming himself." Min-Sik hesitated, looking at the bowl like it might be a trap. Then, slowly, he took it. He took a sip, the heat of the Scotch bonnets clearly registering, but he didn't flinch. He just exhaled, a long, ragged sound, as if the spice was burning away the coldness of the streets. "Your father," Min-Sik said quietly, staring into the broth. "He built this place, brick by brick," Nancy said, leaning her hip against the counter. "He died right there, behind the sewing machine. Heart attack. He worked until his heart literally stopped because he wanted to leave me something safe. Something that was mine." She traced the grain of the wood. "I keep the shop open to keep him alive." Min-Sik set the bowl down. He walked over to the row of mannequins, his fingers brushing the fabric of a half-finished dress. "My parents left me nothing but debt and a target on my back," he murmured. It was the first time he had ever spoken of them. "They were killed in a car bomb meant for my uncle. I was 12. I learned then that safety is a lie. There is only power, and there is victimhood." Nancy looked at him, really looked at him. The expensive suit, the gun, the reputation, it was all armor. Beneath it, he was just a boy standing in the wreckage of a car fire, trying to make sure no one could ever hurt him again. "You're not a victim anymore, Min-Sik," she whispered, stepping closer. "No," he turned to her, his gaze intense but stripped of its usual predator edge. "But I am tired." For a moment, the distance between them vanished. He wasn't the white tiger, and she wasn't the seamstress. They were just two lonely people haunting the same quiet room, bound by the ghosts of the people who had left them behind. Nancy reached out, her hand hovering in the air, and for the first time, she didn't want to run away. She wanted to heal the jagged edges he tried so hard to hide. The peace Nancy had started to feel was an illusion, shattered the moment Junho stepped into her shop. He didn't come with the silent menace of a guard or the weary intensity of Min-Sik. He came with the sneer of a man looking at something filthy. Min-Sik's second-in-command locked the door behind him and flipped the sign to closed, plunging the room into shadow. "You are a loose thread, Miss Ozims," Junho said, his English clipped and cold. He walked toward her, sliding a switchblade from his sleeve. "And in this business, loose threads are cut." Nancy backed against her cutting table, gripping her heavy fabric shears behind her back. "Min-Sik will kill you," she warned, her voice trembling. "Min-Sik is sick," Junho spat, stepping closer until she could smell the stale tobacco on his breath. "He is distracted, weak. He leaves meetings to eat soup in a slum. You are poisoning his mind." He pressed the cold flat of the blade against her cheek. "Leave tonight, or I burn this place down with you inside." The bell didn't chime. The glass of the front door shattered inward with an explosive crash. Before Junho could turn, a blur of dark motion tackled him. It was Min-Sik. He didn't look like the man who had shared soup with her 2 nights ago. He was a demon, He slammed Junho into the wall, the impact cracking the plaster, and then he unleashed a fury that was terrifying to behold. There were no words, only the sickening sound of fists meeting flesh and bone. Min-Sik beat his lieutenant with a savage, blind rage, ignoring Junho's attempts to fight back. He dragged him across the floor, throwing him over the display counter, sending glass and fabric flying. Min-Sik, stop, you're killing him, Nancy screamed, the sound tearing from her throat. Min-Sik froze, his fist raised, his knuckles split and bloody. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving, his eyes wild. Beneath him, Junho was a broken mess, coughing up blood, his face unrecognizable. Min-Sik grabbed Junho by the lapels, hauling him up close. She is off limits, Min-Sik roared, his voice shaking the walls. Do you understand? If you look at her again, I will tear your eyes out. He shoved Junho to the floor. The other guards, who had rushed in after the crash, stood in the doorway. They weren't moving to help. They were staring at Min-Sik, not with loyalty, but with shock. They looked from their broken second in command to the foreign seamstress clutching her shears. Junho spat a mouthful of blood onto the floor. You choose her, he wheezed, his voice bubbling. You choose a stranger over your blood brothers. You have doomed us all, Min-Sik. Nancy looked at the faces of the men in the doorway. She saw the shift, the doubt. Min-Sik stood over the carnage, his chest heaving, but he was alone. Nancy realized with a sick, sinking feeling that by saving her, he had just started a war against his own family. And she was the prize that might cost him his empire. The zipper of the duffel bag sounded like a gunshot in the quiet shop. Nancy didn't turn on the lights. She moved by the orange glow of the street lamps filtering through the blinds, shoving jeans and sweaters into the canvas bag with shaking hands. Her aunt lived deep in Flushing, invisible to the world of bespoke suits and organized crime. If Nancy disappeared, the fracture in the White Tiger syndicate might heal. If she stayed, Min-Sik was a dead man walking. She made it to the back alley, the heavy metal door groaning as she pushed it open. But she didn't make it to the street. High beams blinded her, cutting through the drizzle like searchlights. The engine of the black sedan growled, and before she could turn, the driver's door flew open. Min-Sik didn't look like a boss tonight, he looked like a man unraveling. He marched through the puddles, disregarding the rain soaking his dress shirt, and grabbed the strap of her bag, ripping it from her shoulder with a snarl. You think you can just vanish? He shouted, hurling the bag onto the wet asphalt. After everything, I'm doing this for you. Nancy screamed back, the tears finally spilling over. She shoved his chest, but he was a stone wall. Look at you, Min-Sik. Your men are turning. Junho is rallying them against you. You're going to lose everything because of a seamstress. I don't care about the empire. He roared, seizing her face in his hands, forcing her to look at the desperation raw in his eyes. Let them have the streets. Let them burn the city. You don't mean that, she sobbed, trying to pull away, her heart breaking with every word. You need power. That's who you are. You'll hate me eventually for taking it from you. I need air, he whispered, his voice harsh and broken, pressing his forehead against hers. The anger drained out of him, leaving only a terrifying vulnerability. And for the last month, you have been the only air in the room. If you leave, I suffocate. Do you understand? I cannot breathe without you, Nancy. The confession hung between them, heavy and undeniable. Nancy's resistance shattered. She didn't pull away, she surged forward. Her hands tangled in his wet hair, pulling his mouth down to hers. The kiss wasn't gentle, it was a collision. It tasted of rain and salt and the metallic tang of blood from his split lip. Min-Sik groaned, a low, guttural sound, and swept her up into his arms. He didn't carry her to the car. He kicked the back door of the shop open and carried her inside, into the sanctuary of fabric and dust. He pressed her against the cutting table, sweeping the bolts of silk to the floor in a chaotic crash. There was no room for hesitation, no space for the war waiting outside. His hands were everywhere, desperate to map the reality of her, tearing at buttons and zippers. When they finally came together, skin against fevered skin in the dark, it wasn't just intimacy. It was a frantic, terrifying claiming. He moved like he was trying to merge his soul with hers, anchoring himself to the only thing in his violent world that felt real. Nancy held him just as tight, digging her nails into his shoulders, realizing with a jolt of terrifying clarity that she would let the whole world burn just to keep him warm. The sanctuary didn't last the night. The scent of rain and musk was violently replaced by the chemical stench of gasoline. Nancy barely had time to scream before the windows imploded, showering the cutting table in glass. Men swarmed in, not Min-Sik's guards, but Junho's loyalists. Min-Sik fought like a demon, but a gun butt to the temple dropped him to his knees. Nancy reached for him, but rough hands dragged her away. As they hauled her out the back, she looked up to see a Molotov cocktail arc through the air. It landed on the bolts of vintage wool. The flames roared up instantly, consuming her father's legacy, the unfinished suits, and the life she had built. The last thing she saw before the black bag was pulled over her head was the Ozims tailoring sign melting in the heat. She woke up zip-tied to a chair in a garment district warehouse. It smelled of mildew and dry rot. Junho stood before her, flanked by 3 armed men. In his hand, he held her heavy, silver fabric shears, a trophy snatched from the wreckage. "He will come for me," Nancy rasped, coughing from the lingering smoke in her lungs. "I am counting on it," Junho sneered, tossing the shears onto a crate beside her. The metal door rolled up. Min-Sik walked in. He was alone, unarmed, blood running down his temple from the earlier blow. He didn't look at the guns trained on him. He looked at Nancy. "Let her go," Min-Sik said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "This is between us. There is no us," Junho spat. "Kill him." The warehouse erupted into chaos. Min-Sik moved with lethal precision, disarming the first gunman and using him as a shield, but he was overwhelmed. Junho stepped into the fray, driving a knife into Min-Sik's shoulder. Min-Sik roared, stumbling back, crashing against the crate next to Nancy. He was losing. Junho raised the knife for a killing stroke, his back to Nancy. Adrenaline spiked through her veins, overriding the fear. Nancy threw her weight against the chair, tipping it sideways. Her bound hands scrambled blindly on the crate until her fingers found cold steel. The shears. As Junho lunged, Nancy screamed and thrust the shears upward with both hands. The heavy blades buried themselves deep into Junho's thigh. He howled, staggering back, the knife falling from his grip. The distraction was all Min-Sik needed. He surged forward, ignoring his own wounds, and wrapped his hands around Junho's neck. There was no hesitation, no mercy, just a sickening crack that echoed through the cavernous space. Junho slumped to the floor. Silence fell, broken only by their ragged breathing. Min-Sik turned to her, blood-soaked and trembling. He sliced her ties with the knife, and as the plastic snapped, he collapsed against her, burying his face in her neck. They were alive, but the shop was ash, and the blood on their hands was no longer just a stain, it was a bond forged in red. The smell of smoke was a ghost story now, buried deep beneath layers of fresh white paint, polished mahogany, and the crisp, clean scent of unboxed linen. The new sign above the door didn't just say, Ozims Tailoring. It was etched in frosted glass, bold and unbreakable, reflecting the morning sun that flooded the expanded showroom. Nancy stood in the center of her empire, adjusting the lapel of a mannequin draped in raw silk. She wasn't the terrified woman hiding behind a cutting table anymore. She wore a tailored blazer of her own design, sharp enough to cut, and when the bell above the door chimed, she didn't jump. She smiled. Min-Sik walked in, but the darkness that used to trail behind him like a cape was gone. For the first time since they'd met, he wasn't wearing funeral black. He was dressed in a suit of deep, rich indigo, a color Nancy had chosen, a fabric she had cut, and a fit she had perfected. It didn't hide him in the shadows, it announced him to the light. He moved through the shop, his limp a distant memory, nodding to the 2 assistants Nancy had hired. He wasn't just the silent protector in the corner anymore, he was the silent partner on the lease. The legitimate businesses he now ran were flourishing, built on the same ruthless efficiency he'd once used for violence, but tempered by the woman who now held his leash. The shipment from Milan arrived, Min-Sik said, his voice a low rumble that still made her toes curl. He stopped beside her, his presence warm and grounding. And the West Side Territory leaders said the gift basket. "I believe they are terrified of you." "They should be," Nancy replied, smoothing the fabric on his shoulder, her fingers lingering on the indigo wool. "I know how to use shears." Min-Sik chuckled, a sound that was rare and precious, a secret kept just for her. He caught her hand before she could pull away, his grip firm but gentle. The shop faded away. The assistants, the traffic outside, the ghosts of the warehouse, it all blurred until it was just the two of them. He lifted her hand to his face, just as he had on that rainy night 6 months ago. But there was no desperation now, only devotion. He turned her hand over, inspecting the pad of her index finger. It was healed, the skin smooth, the callus of her trade the only mark left. No blood today, he murmured, his eyes locking onto hers, dark and full of a love that had survived the fire. Not today, Nancy whispered back. Min-Sik pressed his lips to her finger, a soft, lingering kiss that sealed the promise between them. They had stitched a new life together from the scraps of the old one, and this time, the pattern was flawless.